I'm Steve Erlanger. I'm the London Bureau Chief for the New York Times. It's a great honor to be here in a country I have deep affection for. We have a really interesting panel now, which is about the European Union, its future, and Brexit. And just before I came on here, I saw on Twitter someone is offering for Christmas to be paid for in euros, to be sure, a British company, a mug which defines Brexit as a noun. It gives the pronunciation of Brexit, which is not like breakfast. It's not Brexit, it's Brexit. And then its definition is one, Brexit. And then its secondary definition is C number one. Brexit means Brexit, as Theresa May has told us so gnomically. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, we're going to play our little word cloud game. So I've tried to arrange with the organizers to have a word cloud just to ask you, and here I'm vamping a bit so you can get out your phones, to put down the word that you think best expresses your attitude toward Brexit. I would just say one word if possible. If it's a whole clause, it doesn't work. So if we could get that up on the screen and get it going, and if it fails, we'll move on. But let's try to do that. Which doesn't seem to be functioning. Well, if it's not going to function, that's fine. One of the great debates in Britain, and I live in Britain, is now that the people have spoken, what did the people mean? That's half the problem. As Brecht used to say, the people have decided to have a new government. It's very similar. Here, we're beginning to get words. That's great. I appreciate that. So we see stupid, we see uninformed, we see failure, discomfort, concern, surprise. We do have exciting. We also have useless. What I don't see other than exciting is opportunity, which is part of the great debate in Britain. The government in Britain is obviously trying to negotiate first with itself. What does Brexit mean? It's trying to negotiate with itself what kind of deal it would like to see. And it seems to be doing that without much reference to what the rest of the European Union might want from Britain. Because after all, just to remind you, this will be a negotiation that involves 27 other sovereign states. It has to be approved by consensus. One state could throw the whole thing into nothingness, even after 2 years of negotiation. So we have to discuss all the implications of this and what it means for Europe with a very good panel, which I'll just very briefly introduce to you. On your left, Marek, Belka, former Polish Prime Minister, former Polish Finance Minister, former European head of the IMF, former Polish central banker, now professor of economics. Hans Kundnani, who works for the German Marshall Fund in Washington, but is British, but has a real expertise in Germany, speaks German, has written very, very well about Germany and its foreign and domestic policies. Next to him is Minister Scicluna, who's the Minister of Finance from Malta. And Malta is about to take over the EU presidency in January. So he's sitting in a very hot seat, though it looks rather comfortable there. And next to him, of course, is Hubert Vedrine, who was former French foreign minister under Jospin, was an advisor to Mitterrand, author, risk consultant, and well-known, I think, to everyone here. So I just wanted to begin, perhaps, by asking Marek, how important Brexit is, do you think? What is the understanding Europeans have for it? Sometimes I think in Britain, people believe that the Europeans will somehow give in and give them a sweet deal because Britain matters so much. And then I think there are a lot of people in Europe who think that Britain in the end will just give it up entirely and find some way not to leave the European Union. So why don't you start us off?
Thank you. Well, first let's assume that Brexit is Brexit, which means that it really happens and it's irreversible. Assumption. Number two, let's assume that we know something. Because one thing certain is that the consequences of Brexit, both for the UK and the European Union and the world, are to a certain extent uncertain. So let's take these two assumptions and then go on speculating. Let's divide the consequences into economic and political ones, short run and longer run. Well, let's start with the UK. Short-term economic consequences, we know. Weakening of the sterling with both somewhat negative and somewhat positive consequences, basically compensating themselves. The long-term Brexit consequences are expected to be largely very negative for the UK. As to the economic consequences for the European Union, they are both short-term and long-term negligible. Now let's turn to political consequences. The political consequences, short-term political consequences for the UK, well, we have seen already. The naive, immature Prime Minister had to go. UKIP is basically out of the scene. What comes next, we'll see. It depends largely on the results of the negotiations with the European Union about the terms of Brexit. But for the world and for the European Union, political consequences in the UK largely do not matter. So what is really the problem with Brexit? Well, it's the short-term, at least short-term political earthquake that Brexit may add to in the European Union. Short-term. Well, we'll see that Brexit enlarges the international community of pyromaniacs. And this, for example, I haven't met any French friend or interlocutor who would promise me that Marine Le Pen will not become the president of France. Okay? I hope they are right. But remember what we thought about Brexit, remember what we thought about Donald Trump, and I come from a country that we had our own traumatic experience similar to that. So suppose that France holds up, Germany holds up, which will stop drifting of Italy into the same camp of pyromaniacs, then the political consequences of Brexit for the European Union will largely be contained. But the danger exists. So, summing up, long-term economic consequences for Britain, serious, very serious. Short-term political consequences for Europe, also serious. This is how the things, in my view, looks like. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then one of the things I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously Britain was a big advocate of Poland joining the European Union. I mean, of the enlargement. I mean, do you think Britain's leaving will have an impact on domestic politics in Poland? Does it affect Poland's view of how the European Union will grow or shrink?
Well, on all accounts, Brexit is negative for Poland. Poland, as the UK, are not Eurogroup countries. So the withdrawal of Britain weakens the so-called NEG, non-Eurogroup. And of course, if you still wish to avoid so-called Europe of many speeds, which is unrealistic, then the chances for avoiding this are slimmer after Brexit. But the most important thing is that Brexit weakens European Union, and weak European Union is very bad for Poland. No matter what our current rulers say, just look at the map.
Thank you.
Period.
Hans, you're the Brit in the room. Is Britain exaggerating its importance to everyone else? What's your sense of how it might flow, this great debate that's going on inside? You know, there are issues of hard and soft Brexit, issues of migration. Obviously, the government is beginning to set priorities, but nothing official yet.
So let me first of all say that I think the answer to nearly every question I'm going to get asked is, I don't know. Because I think...
Oh, don't be honest. Just go ahead.
I think even until about a month ago, it seemed to me very, very difficult to predict what the outcome of Brexit was going to be. And I have to say now, since the election of Donald Trump as US president, I feel that's added a new element of uncertainty that potentially could completely transform the relationship between Britain and the EU in a different way, although again, I wouldn't claim any certainty about how that's going to evolve. So I think there are so many moving pieces of this now, and I think the world in general, following the election of Trump, is going to be so unpredictable that all kinds of things might happen that I think are going to affect this. Having said all that, in answer to your question about the sort of relative importance of the UK on the one side and the EU on the other side, I think it's certainly true. I've been struck, and I should say, although I'm a Brit, I spent the last sort of year or so living in Berlin and then went back to Britain for 2 months over the summer and spent essentially the 2 months after the referendum in Britain, and since then have been in DC. So I'm slightly looking at Britain now from the perspective of an outsider, and I sort of come back periodically, and what struck me, I was in Britain for the last couple of weeks, and what struck me was how the debate really hadn't moved on at all, and it was this same mantra of Brexit means Brexit, and we want our cake and we want to be able to eat it. The latest sort of twist on this, insofar as it is a twist, is this idea of, you mentioned the sort of debate about hard Brexit versus soft Brexit. The latest twist on this is hard Brexit but with a soft landing. And by that, what is meant is this idea of a temporary arrangement for a few years. But it's not clear whether that's possible or what that would look like. But my impression, as I say, coming at this somewhat now from the perspective of an outsider, is how parochial the debate in Britain is. You said at the beginning, Steve, that in Britain we're sort of negotiating with ourselves, first of all, to figure out what we want. The people that voted to leave were this extraordinarily diverse group of people, I think, that voted to leave for all different kinds of reasons. And so there's an internal negotiation going on, and that's part of what the hard Brexit, soft Brexit discussion, I think, is about, because, as I think George Osborne put it at one point, a majority of Brits voted for Brexit, but not necessarily for a hard Brexit. So that's all being played out. But when you watch the debate in Britain, it is as if the only thing that matters is what the Brits want. Once they can figure out what they want, they will get it. And there doesn't seem to be very much awareness, even now, 6 months on from the referendum, of the way in which there's internal politics in the rest of the EU, and that's going to affect what's possible and what's not. Just finally, though, to come back to the Trump question, because I do really think this potentially really changes things. I think this actually might put Britain in a stronger position for the simple reason that the US security guarantee now is in doubt, it seems to me. And the UK, as one of the two EU member states currently, along with France, that is a nuclear power and that has significant military capabilities, I think does now, I think the EU does need the UK in a way that it didn't before, frankly. And this was quite interesting a couple of weeks ago when the Polish Prime Minister came to number 10. And there was lots of speculation about whether what's happening here is that the Brits, who are expanding security cooperation with Poland on a bilateral basis, whether that is in the expectation of some kind of concession, whether it's around freedom of movement or around something else in the Brexit negotiations. And so I think that really does actually, I mean, I think there's an element of truth to the idea that actually now Britain is in a slightly stronger position than it was before.
I mean, certainly it's considered part of Britain's bargaining power that it with France are the main military powers. One other comparison struck me between the Brexiters and Trump supporters is though both of them won, they both think they're going to be betrayed. The Brexiters think somewhere along the line, Theresa May is going to pull out the rug from underneath them because she's actually a Remainer. And Philip Hammond, the Treasury Secretary, is trying to work out a deal that seems too soft for those people who favor Brexit. So there's quite a lot of anger and suspicion of elites of the government, which has a thin majority. And it's the same in America too. Trump supporters are already getting very anxious that there are too many Goldman Sachs people and too much elite, and that somehow Trump will also betray them. And I think this kind of defensiveness, political defensiveness, will be very interesting to watch. Mr. Scicluna, you're about to have to deal at least with the beginning, presumably of Article 50. What should Britain expect? Or to put it another way, I mean, what does Europe want from Britain? I mean, is it easier to just have a hard Brexit and negotiate something else down the road? How complicated a divorce is this really going to be?
You took the word, it's divorce. This is a divorce. And like any divorce, it could be acrimonious, you know, when one side would want everything, including the car and the dustbin. Or it could be, you know, an arrangement, consensual arrangement, you know, with the least pain to both sides. They know they've got to separate and they want a quick one. And try to put aside all the issues and difficulties and so on. Now, as you said, what would be the scenario? I mean, the problem is that the EU side is not one country. There are 27 countries. There are three institutions. There's the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. So although on paper the Commission will start the negotiations, the Council wants to keep control. The Council of Ministers, again, another 27 ministers want to keep, or prime ministers want to keep control of the way it's doing. And then the biggest problem of all, in the sense of its bigger institution and more independent-minded people and parties, is the European Parliament. They would want their say as well. So I don't think it could be a simple divorce. It cannot be avoided. Now, I think would rather, at this point, okay, another issue is whether it's hard or soft. It's which of the two sides will blink first. In other words, who would suffer the short-term consequences? If it's the EU, probably not. And I think it would be more probably that the UK, there will be more investment being lost, companies moving, and that scenario would definitely have an impact on one side, on one of the partners. So I think that's also a probable scenario. I think the interesting questions for the EU is not whether it will get the upper hand or whether it will win or not, but what caused the divorce in the first place, and whether there are, same feelings within the continent. And in fact, I'm referring to the populist parties, and say exactly, whether the whole system is crumbling, and that is more a worry than the question of Brexit.
I very much want to get to that. But first, I want to ask you, because divorce is also usually about money. Money is always an issue. And the Brits are committed to huge amounts of money, ongoing money, into an ongoing budget. And there have been figures thrown around of 60 billion euros owed. Are people just setting out stalls for a negotiation? Or are they making hardline statements about the amount of money involved in the divorce? Or are these realistic figures?
Well, the EU as a whole would lose a very big share, as the UK shares. Although from the EU side there are projects being undertaken, and it's not a question of leaving a bridge halfway because we're out, So if they're going to continue with that bridge, so to speak, they still need to contribute. So that is one reason, most probably, that it will not be a cliff thing, but it would be prolonged, more tapered than the 2 years we have in mind.
Right. Yeah, one thing I also wanted to ask you, as Hans was saying, there's much more talk now in Britain of a transitional agreement that would somehow govern Britain's customs trade, certainly, if not more than that, that would go on beyond the 2-year deadline of Article 50, to supposedly allow the negotiation of a broader free trade deal with the EU that would take longer. Some people, the one with Canada took 7 years. Do you see much prospect in that? Is that a realistic idea?
Well, it depends how much politics get into it, and because politics can block and create big problems, and it can undo. And just, I've seen many big problems, which the technician would say it's impossible, and just the politicians will it, and that's it, it's solved. Sometimes I'm really surprised with my experience there. So it depends on the political will as well.
I was talking to Jonathan Hill, Lord Hill, who was the last British commissioner, and one of the things that he'd said was that it would, in the end, be about politics, and if feelings were hot and angry, it'd be much harder to make a deal, and that he was very worried about the tone of the debate thus far. Turning to Monsieur Vedrine, you've watched this circus going on for quite a long time. What, in your view, are the implications of Brexit for the rest of the European Union? Do you think it's fundamental? Is it exaggerated? What do you think?
D'abord, il faut prévenir que je vais parler en français.
Oui.
I'm going to speak in French.
Est-ce que tout le monde est prêt à affronter ce choc?
So you'll have to manage this linguistic shock.
On avance.
On laisse une minute pour que les gens s'équipent.
So let's leave some time for people to get the headsets. Can you get the English translation?
Is everybody happy?
Yeah, okay.
Commencez, monsieur.
You can start, sir.
Bon. En ce qui me concerne,
Well, for me,
je considère que le Brexit
I consider
doit
that
être analysé uniquement
Brexit should not be analyzed only as a British aberration, but it is a sign for a wider phenomenon.
Je pense que c'était un référendum inutile.
Of course, I think that it was an unuseful and irrational decision and referendum, but it's useless today to repeat this. But we can indeed analyze this as the result of a special British sit-in with the specific issues for Great Britain and relations between France and Great Britain, or analyze it, as it is my opinion, as a sign for a wider issue. What I mean by wider issue is that it seems to me that in Europe, for different reasons, the peoples are just stepping back from the European project. It changes from one country to another with different degrees. Of course, some countries are so much convinced, but if you add the anti-European countries that the press is wrong to call Eurosceptics, because we have another type of people. We do not have the same political responses. We have anti-political groups for ideological reasons, demagogical reasons, or whatever. People who voted for Brexit are not only skeptical. There are Euro skeptical, Euro whatever. Marine Le Pen in France, I don't think that she will be president in France, but it's another issue. She's not Euro-skeptical. She is hostile to Europe, as the people at the far left. In addition to these groups, you have other people who have been deceived. We have promised to them the social Europe, which did not happen. They have been deceived by socialist governments as well. In addition to this, you have people who are allergic to Europe. The President of the Commission said that we were wrong to adopt too much regulations since the single market. The single market is a good idea, but the implementations of standardizations that were not done on the basis of objectives. We had too much detailed regulations, and we indeed have many regulations for bananas, for electric devices, for all different items. So it's Juncker who is saying this. He's not anti-European. He said, indeed, it was wrong to have too much regulations. It's true that states required that. France asked for this a lot, but this did not settle the problem, the issue. It's not because the states were asking for too much regulation that the Commission has turned this into a crazy system with the judicial and the parliament intervening. Even if we mention here the causes, we have the problem. If you have all these categories of people, these groups, you reach high levels of people. And don't forget that for European elections, we have 60% of people abstaining, so as average. So the pro-Europeans, conventional ones, the historical ones, center-left, center-right, they might represent 15 to 20%. At the utmost. The federalist Europeans, we can read this in the economic newspapers, but those people do not exist as voters. Those who really say we should be brave and go for the federal approach, they present nothing, not much. So the real problem for Europe today, even before Brexit, the first issue, it's not about the provocations of Putin or the migration, refugees, the lack of growth, of all that. The real problem is that peoples are just stepping back from the historical projects. We could say that this is regrettable. We could condemn it. We could talk about populism. When people do not vote as the elite wants people to vote, it's no use to blame them. In Europe, we have an issue that you find in all democracies around the world, is that the popular classes and the middle-class classes no longer believe what has been said about globalization, and it's not only the case for Trump in the United States. So we have here the minorities against the majorities and all this, but we could find this shocking or despicable, whatever, but we have what I might call an electoral insurrection. I think that we have to ponder about the Brexit issue, but the European system is not thoroughly changed in the way it functions to clarify the roles on the European level and the nation states level. If we do not bring more democracy within the European system, I think that the European project is at risk. It's not going to be destroyed, but it could go around in vast circles. So I might add the following sentence. What is being said today is that nobody knows today how things will evolve, will turn out. Nobody here could say what will be the position of Great Britain in 1 or 2 years. Nobody could forecast this, even if we start with Article 15. Nobody would know what will be the position of the Europeans within 1 or 2 years. Of course, we'll have negotiations that will be hard. You know, the divorce will lead us to insult each other. But Great Britain cannot in 1.5 years decide to stop totally. We will have negotiations and nobody could tell. We have been seeking a solution, we cannot find it. You know, the hard ones who know, people who would say the British did not behave rightly when they voted in this way. Some people would say that would be absurd for us to deprive ourselves of Great Britain. So it's strange to say this today, but we do need to reach a compromise between Great Britain and Europe by 2018. Thank you.
One thing that always strikes me is that world orders, like relationships, get stale. And they get cranky, and people argue about things. I mean, we see this at the United Nations, we see it at the World Bank, we see it at the IMF. We certainly see it in the European Union, which was a wonderful idea of the last century and was a great response to the challenges of World War II and what happened afterwards. But with the enlargement, without deepening, the European Union became so big, so diverse, so different in terms of income, in terms of productivity, in terms of expectations. I was just in Slovakia, which we think of as a very nice country that's doing fine. It's part of the Eurozone. They're having the same structural problems that Hungary's having, that Poland under its new government is having. They're slipping away, they're drifting. They're happy to be passengers on the train of the European Union, but they don't want to pay for their ticket. And that's part of the question, which is solidarity. The migrant crisis seemed to show a tremendous challenge to solidarity, as did the Greek crisis, which hasn't finished. Which may be coming back again. We may have a year in which we have French elections, German elections, Dutch elections, Italian elections, and Greek elections. So it's, you know, how does Europe manage Brexit while it's kind of looking into its own stomach all the time? So I wonder whether any of you wanted to respond to this, because what we're really talking about is what Hubert began to talk about, which is the European Union so complacent that it simply will keep going on until people really lose faith in it? Or is it willing somehow to change the way it's structured and the way it deals with its constituents? So I wondered if any of you wanted to talk to that. Mr. Scicluna, do you want to start?
I mean, it's not a question of one or the other. I mean, the negotiations is a procedure which would keep the media happy every day. But I think it is a watershed. And although the post-Brexit is not going to be either heaven or hell, it will be the same. Purgatory, day, hard work every day. But it's the fact that while the Federalists or the Eurosceptics were a minority, How come that the silent middle center majority all of a sudden loses all rationale and goes, to extremities? Syriza in Greece, and so on. I mean, no need to mention Podemos and small, but and so on. I mean, you can say the same for the United States. And that's the basic question, that the structure, if we continue tinkering with it, it's not enough. At the moment, we're postponing decisions. For example, EDIS, the common insurance for deposit guarantee. Germany is hesitating and saying, keep it out of the table until the election and so on. So postponing will do for a while, but it's not a long-term thing. I mean, people are asking, how did we do? After all, the UK was not even a member of the Eurozone.
Right.
I mean, the Eurozone countries were on their own. Did they do a good job? Did we do a good job? In some ways, the bailouts were an act of solidarity. Not in all countries that they managed, but Ireland did well, and Portugal and Spain
okay.
in a way, yes. But I mean, it's not an easy thing.
Portugal's
but
back into trouble.
Greece was the exception.
Yeah.
But so those were the good things. The bad things is that our performance post-crisis hasn't compared. When compared to the US, is nothing to talk or write home about.
Yeah. Marek, did you?
Well, you raised in your intervention 3 huge problems. I'll deal with them in a very short way. Enlargement. The real problem with enlargement of the EU was to accept Britain in the EU. Everything else is dwarfed by it.
Well, that was 44 years ago.
Okay, 40 years ago and 40 years of torture. Now with sudden death.
Amusement, wouldn't you say, or torture?
Number 2, Brexit. Brexit is about euro. Was it a project that was introduced in the right sequence, in the right way, and how do we go about it? This has nothing to do with Brexit. This has nothing to do with refugees. It only amplifies some of the problems. But it's too big a problem to discuss it now. And the third one is refugees. And let me elaborate a bit on this. Europe has always been a region of immigration. 2 million people a year for 20 years. Last year it was 3 million. Well, did it make such a huge difference? Maybe, but I don't think it explains everything. Well, maybe it's the confluence of immigration and Islamic terrorism. Well, look at Britain. All the terrorist attacks that happened there were not carried out by immigrants, certainly not by Polish and Romanian immigrants, but by second-generation Pakistanis. I'm sorry for the...
No, it's true.
Yeah, okay. So what's wrong with... What was at the source of this overreaction of Europeans to refugees? I think it's a part of a bigger problem. It's a problem of revolt of the elites, that against the elites,
Sure.
of the people against the elites. The people don't have trust into what we say, into what statistics show, into what theoretical models or practical policies show. And in such a situation, it's very easy to excite people. You don't even need refugees to be against them. My country is the best example of it. So refugees is not really about refugees. The refugee crisis is part of a bigger crisis of probably, I'm sorry for being too bombastic, a crisis of Western democracy.
Yeah, that's right. And also somehow a period where demagoguery works in politics. I mean, certainly the British campaign was full of untruths, which seemed to persist. And this has been followed through by the campaign in America too. But what struck me about the migrant issue was partly the fact that Germany, which had been so important, which is basically the hegemon of Europe, which has been asking other countries to get in line on issues like Greece and other things, suddenly created a crisis for everyone. And there was a lot of schadenfreude among other European members, and a lot of feeling that, you know, Germany now was asking them for big favors about migrants and quotas. And there are a lot of people who just didn't want to help her out, which made sense too. And then, of course, in Britain, as you rightly say, the migrant question, it's not about Syrians, it's about white Christian migrants from Eastern Europe. That's been the problem. So Britain's straight. Every unhappy country is unhappy in its own way. Monsieur Vedrine, you wanted to say something.
Oui, je voudrais redire que,
Yes, I would like to
à
add
mon avis, si on ne réconcilie
that
pas
if we do not reconcile the leaders and populations, there will be no solutions.
pas la peine d'ajouter des lamentations,
It is useless to add any complaints.
il faut donc réconcilier les
We
peuples
need
d'Europe.
to reconcile populations and Europe. I would like to quote Schäuble, who is a great European.
Plusieurs fois ces derniers mois,
In the recent months, he repeated quite a few times that it is very difficult to never take populations into account.
allemand, en Europe. On a fait un système européen
We are dealing with a European system that has become
qui veut continuer
a system which is to continue regardless of anything and everything, that takes no vote into consideration.
Quand il y a un référendum raté,
If there is a referendum that doesn't give the desired result, there is a new one that is presented, and therefore we do not realize that for the past 20 years we have hindered the democratic psyche of the European population. This is a system that wishes to continue endlessly, that does not listen, that does not wish to correct anything. And if we do not manage to correct the system, I will tell you that the European project will end. What does it mean to listen to populations? It's quite complicated. The reason why elites hate populations is that populations have an odd identity, that they're chauvinist and they're focused on security. They want to hold on to sovereignty, identity, and they want to be safe and secure. And we respond with growth, and growth is not sufficient. So I believe that if these demands take humongous dimensions, is because there haven't been any reasonable responses. If there is this huge historical responsibility for the past 20 to 30 years, that initially started with good intentions, and we were not able to provide the right responses. With the different attitudes, we are translating this negative sentiment towards these demands, and we need to be able to give a reasonable response to these requests and demands, and particularly get out of the absolute confusion today where we have no idea of who handles what. So we are requesting certain things of Europe that are not part of its mission. We are criticizing Europe. There is some justified criticism, there is some unjustified criticism. And this is different in the United States. This issue isn't existent in the United States or in Brazil, so I'd like to come back to this point. And we cannot place at the same level the different issues that we are dealing with, and there's this internal issue. If we manage to resolve this issue, we need to organize a true conference review these governments without these institutions. It might be shocking, but this is intentional. If we manage to clarify this, all of the other issues regarding refugees and so forth have their solutions. And the European Union will be able to start with a new legitimacy. And if we do not succeed in this task, well, we might be very worried.
Around Toulon and Marseille, trying to talk to National Front mayors and people. And a lot of people said we had our referendum in 2005 when we voted down the treaty that Giscard had drafted, but somehow we're still in Europe anyway. So what you say is true. I mean, people feel as if they had a voice, but the voice was ignored, and somehow Europe goes on anyway. Of course, people like the National Front blame Europe for things that really are national competencies. I mean, Europe is a great scapegoat. But, you know, my fear, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think Marine Le Pen has a majority in France because the French know Marine Le Pen. She's not a new surprise.
Cher ami, je ne parle pas de Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen.
We're not talking about Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen has about 25 to 30% of votes. So those who are at unease with Europe are 75% of people. There are a lot of people that are don't agree with what Europe has become and that are not for the Front National Front. We are not threatened by the Front National. This is absolutely hysterical. We are threatened by the setback of the backing out of normal people, quote unquote.
France pulls away, the whole union begins to dissolve. I mean, Britain's one thing, France is quite something else. Hans?
Well, I mean, I very much agree with what Monsieur Vedrine said about, I mean, I think European elites need to be a bit self-critical at this moment and not simply dismiss the Brexit vote as a British aberration, as you put it, or as something irrational. And it's complicated because on the one hand, I think you're right that the reasons that people voted to leave the EU in the UK, many of those concerns are shared elsewhere in the EU, if not to the same extent. At the same time, there are differences, particularly around this issue of immigration, which I want to come back to in a second. But I think that the difficulty now for the EU is not so much complacency, actually, as you were suggesting, Steve, because there have been so many wake-up calls now. I mean, I can't hear this phrase wake-up call anymore because there have just been so many. And actually, after each of these wake-up calls, and Brexit being the penultimate one, I mean, Trump is the latest, I think. But what I thought was very striking was before the Brexit referendum, you had, I mean, Europe was sort of divided into optimists and pessimists. The pessimists said this would be disastrous for the EU if the Brits vote to leave, but they probably won't do it. The optimists said, no, this would be a huge opportunity for the EU to move ahead with further integration. But both the optimists and the pessimists were agreed that if this actually does happen, and nobody really believed that it would, outside of Britain at least, we have to act. And what's remarkable is 6 months later, almost nothing has happened. There's a little bit of movement around European security policy, but even there it's minimal. And on the real issues which are driving this surge in Euroscepticism, and I would say that it is largely economic policy around the Eurozone and refugee policy. There is really no kind of possibility of moving forward. And the reason for that is not complacency, it's the fact that it's quite difficult. I mean, it's basically the fault lines that exist within the EU. I mean, forget Britain. The fault lines that exist within the rest of the EU, between north and south, creditors and debtors, between east and west, between left and right. And what that means, without going into too much detail, is it's really difficult to see how you move ahead with more Europe, as it were. Treaty change is completely impossible, but even other steps in integration are opposed by member states like the Netherlands and Poland, and so it's simply impossible to move ahead. The status quo is unsustainable. I think most people would agree. And it's unthinkable to most pro-Europeans to go into reverse, as it were. So whether you're talking about the single currency or whether you're talking about Schengen, to think about how you would actually unwind some of those steps in integration. The fear is that that would lead to disintegration. So we're stuck, I think, with this unsustainable status quo. And I think actually the biggest change, the historic change, is now that Germany is a status quo power on European integration. It doesn't want further integration. And that, I think, is a historic change, and one that I worry actually could actually do the EU. Just briefly, though, on the immigration question, because I think it's important. There is this tendency outside of Britain to see the British vote to leave, insofar as it was driven by concerns around immigration, as being simply an expression of xenophobia. I think that's too simplistic. There are a small number of Brits who are simply racist or xenophobic, but unless I really don't know my country, and that is possible, I've been wondering that a bit since the Brexit referendum. My instinct is that most of the Brits who voted to leave because of concerns about immigration, it's not actually xenophobia. What it is a concern that you can agree with or disagree with, which is not opposed to immigration per se, it's opposed to uncontrolled immigration. And this is why it's directed against people from other EU member states. Actually, this is, I think, something, it's not I voted to remain, and both of my parents are immigrants. It's not a concern I particularly share, but it seems to me it's a rational concern, and it's a concern that everybody in this room who's not from an EU member state takes for granted that their country can decide how many immigrants can come into their country on an annual basis, what kind of immigrants, whether to change that policy year by year. And it is a simple fact that EU member states, including Britain, which is not in Schengen, have essentially surrendered the possibility of doing that. And I think it's a rational concern. I personally, it's not something I care about particularly that much, but it's a reasonable concern, it seems to me, certainly a rational one, for British people to say, actually, we would like to control our own borders.
Yeah. And of course, part of the problem was, as much of Europe was suffering high unemployment and low growth, Britain was creating jobs. So why wouldn't you go to Britain to work, right? I mean, even if you didn't stay.
Yes.
Can
I just add one final thought, which is on your point about why people distrust experts and data. This was a big feature of the British discussion. It is partly because the experts got it wrong, specifically on this question of migration. When the enlargement of the Big Bang enlargement happened, the government wildly underestimated the number of Poles and people from other Central and Eastern European countries who would come.
Sure, because partly nobody was counting on 2008 and the Depression. Marek wants to say something, and I'd like to take a round of questions from anyone in the audience who would like to participate. So, Marek, please.
Marc, vous avez quelque chose à dire d'abord?
Okay. As far as this argument with British concerns, I'm sorry, I got some
feedback.
Other language in my ears. Well, if I have to look at the concerns of British voters, well, okay, I can understand what you said, but Britain is out of Eurozone, the most ambitious and most contentious and probably crisis-prone project, out of Schengen, out of social charter, forget about, burden of regulatory burden, and out of many judicial let's say, solutions that are common for Europe. So there must be something more, which is the general distrust and toward the experts, the pundits say this is a bigger thing. Of course, experts do err. Well, the biggest mistake was 2007-2008, which we haven't recovered fully from. The other is the number of immigrants. But I think that this wouldn't be destructive in a different world, in a world where democracy would function normally, when there would be a rational discussion. And there is no rational discussion. Why? That's another problem.
Well, let's try to have part of one here. Can I have some hands? Sir, here, I've got a microphone. So if I could just ask you to introduce yourself and just try to be brief so we can get as many people as possible.
I'm Mats Karlsson. I'm the director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I wonder whether we should not contemplate a trajectory that might reverse Brexit. I'm putting it squarely on the table, not because of disrespect for a democratic election, but simply for realistic reasons. The Brexit referendum was one of the first elections are always complicated, that was actually put forward to the people with real post-truth language in it. It was based on false information to people. Now, I wonder what the Brits will actually say when they discover what Marek Belka described at the beginning, that there basically isn't a soft Brexit available. It's not because the EU27 is not kind to Britain or wouldn't want to be in a family. Britain is very important to Europe. There I disagree with you. Europe is important to Britain. We need Britain. But it's going to be very difficult to even imagine a soft Brexit. And when Britain sees this, they see that they face bad, very bad, or catastrophic. There isn't a good solution. Now, when this goes through the Parliament discussion, I think that we should take care to allow for the possibility that ration comes back. I do not understand why we have to think about identity, security, and sovereignty instead of equality, liberty, and fraternity. I don't think we should lose confidence. That's my point.
Thank you very, very much. There's a questioner here. Please, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, we...
Just identify yourself again, even though everyone knows who you are. Please.
Yes, Karim from Policy Center. My question is, we can imagine a sabotage by bureaucrats, as Mr. Vedrine mentioned, of the process. We enter negotiations. In 2 years, we all agree, Britain and European Unions, they agree it's impossible. But that's again another sabotage and not listening to the people. So I want to come back to Mr. Vedrine's points. Why is it that institutions, the European institutions, the system is not listening to the voice of the people? By that I mean also that those that do not vote, because it's very important. Why it is important, and why is it in your, from a point of view, and why, how to take actions, how to take again the initiative. Donc ma question peut-être pour faciliter en français, on peut toujours imaginer.
In order to make it easier, we can always think about sabotage to make the negotiations fail, but this is also a way not to listen to the population. So how to take back the initiative, and why did the system lose its control? Why did we go off board, and how to get back in control and do what you have been talking about, Europe that's listening and goes the way that the majority would like, and avoid this disconnection between the reality and the elite.
The lady here, and then there's, and then we'll go back to the panel, please.
Patricia Sasnal, the Polish Institute of International Affairs, or another Pole. I have to say that I'm devastated by what was said in the panel, and I think it's part of the problem, how the elite talks about the European Union. Because the European Union is not disconnected from the people. Quite the contrary, the national governments are. The European Union does everything for the people. It's the free market, the free movement, the security whatever, you name it, and we could go on and on. European Union is an entity that gives a synergic effect of 1 + 1 being 3. And I think the problem is how we talk about the European Union. And I did not sense any European feeling in what the 4 Europeans were saying. Why is that? You should, perhaps if I could recommend explaining a little bit to the African public and the Latin American public that the European project is a great project that needs to be defended.
Dziękuję wam. Okay. And then you, and then back to them.
I'm afraid.
No, go ahead. No. Here. Just speak loudly into this. Go, just talk.
Oh, here's another one.
Okay. Fine.
I'm Alfredo Valadão from Sciences Po Paris and a fellow at OCP Policy Center. I do agree with Hubert Vedrine's conclusion, and I do agree there is a huge distrust vis-à-vis not only European institutions, but also vis-à-vis national governments in Europe. But I'm very skeptical about the idea that there is a kind of insurrection of the masses against the elites. If you look at the results of the votes everywhere, including the United States, you see that it's a 50-50 vote, more or less, of people. So it's much more one part of the people against another part of the people. And the elites in the middle, then they don't know what to do with it. And it's because what we've seen is that it's true that there is a lot of people who are against what is going on, who needs identity, security, whatever, the losers, but there's a lot of people who are cosmopolitan, who like what is happening, etc. And these are more or less the same guys. And they're both important, one and the other.
Okay.
So the problem is how the elites, or how the ruling classes, can find a way to deal with this problem, which is one part of the people against the other part of the people.
It's clear. Okay, thank you. Sir.
Thank you. I'm Emil Chireno from the Dominican Republic. As an attorney, I do know that divorces are complex, there's usually hard feelings involved, and money matters. So I wonder, given the relevance of the single market access for the British economy, are there any incentives at all on the side of the European Union for a soft Brexit?
Thank you. No, I'm sorry, I think we're going to, well, let's do you, and then we'll go back to the panel. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Fatem Zarabiez. I'm from Morocco. I'm both French and Moroccan. I love the EU, and I've studied economics, and I was very happy with the EU and everything around Europe globalization. But the thing is, for the past 6 years, I've stopped watching the news, listening to the main leaders, because simply we have, as young people, we have stopped believing in the project leaders are selling to us. I love the idea of Europe, but I don't believe anymore in the leaders. So my question is, are leaders today prepared to solve the challenges of the countries that we are facing today? Are they really prepared mentally to solve all these challenges the people need to change?
Okay. Thank you. I think given our time, because we've only got till 7, what I'm going to do is just go back to the panel. You could answer whatever you like, speak to the points that you would like to speak to, but do try to give a response to the last lady about whether you feel yourselves and your generation have the will, the capacity, the open-mindedness to deal with the challenge that she just expressed. So let's go, if you like, in reverse order. Monsieur Vedrine, c'est à vous.
Je ne sais pas quoi répondre, c'est une question tellement vague et vaste.
I don't know what to answer.
On peut dire ce qu'on veut, bon. On peut dire ça ce qu'on veut.
A wide scope question, we can say anything. The challenges, leaders, regarding the European issue, which is our topic, many presentations proved why the system cannot be reformed or doesn't want to be reformed. So it's either this European system, the way Donald Tusk thinks of it, when it needs to be reformed, while waiting for the critics, and we should not pretend that it is more legitimate than the populations. Either the system can solve the solutions, or we need something that's more rigorous, that's more clear. Giscard d'Estaing, Helmut Schmidt, two main Europeans had talked before Schmidt died. They had the meeting in Paris a couple years ago, and they said when we created the European Parliament, we thought that we had shocked the spirit and created the European mind and European population, and we failed. That's what they said, we failed. This is what Giscard d'Estaing and Schmidt said. And someone told them, so how are we going to democratically control the Eurozone? And they answered, we have to reintegrate the national parliaments. And they are not anti-Europeans. There are so many Europeans who were historically Europeans, and not too long ago, I had talked to a person who was the chief of staff of Jean Monnet, a person who was 92 years old, and he told me we never thought initially that the European Commission will be in charge of putting all the regulations. We wanted a political commission, not to be national, so it's ambitious, but not someone that's over the nations and that regulates everything. These are the legitimate Europeans who historically drafted it. They listened to the population and they know what the threat was. So we have to listen to this, introduce it, and reasonably answer the needs. And if the needs become crazy, then the project is in danger.
I do sometimes wonder we ought to have a T-shirt that said, "What would Jean Monnet do?" Mr. Scicluna.
I think the lady is right. To non-Europeans, we look like a big family squabbling all the time, screaming at each other. And, you know, from the outside, it could be, you think that the family hates each other. Well, it's not always the case. If it's a Mediterranean family, that's normal, and they could really love each other a lot. In fact, we do. So it's just, however, that we are concentrating on certain issues. And from my point of view, which is finance, I was in the European Parliament for 5 years in Econ and 4 years in the ECOFIN. I could say that we're always reacting all the time, especially after a crisis of that nature of 2008-9, that we have not put in any political risks. It's really funny. We talk always of risk, managing risk, talking about banks and so on, but when it comes to macroprudential rules, we just ignore them completely, and then we face up with problems. And so if it's, you know, sanctions on Portugal, why didn't we, and Spain, why didn't we think about them in the first place? The same with the banking union. We've spent 1.5 years. We passed all the legislation, you know, intergovernmental agreements, so complicated. And now it's brand new, the banking union. Now we have Italy, and we balked, you know, and say, but, you know, the political situation. So we need to put in and factor in the macroprudential policies, the political risks.
Yeah, everyone always likes to say that the European Union only moves ahead when it's challenged and through crisis, but I begin to wonder myself. Hans, please.
So maybe 3 points. The first, and this is not meant to be facetious, I think these marital metaphors are really unhelpful, actually, because states...
Do you speak from experience?
Actually, no, but states are not like people. And the process of Britain withdrawing from the EU is not a divorce, actually, and I think it's really unhelpful to think of it in that way. It doesn't help us understand what's going on, and I think it emotionalizes actually something which actually shouldn't be that emotional. Secondly, in response to Patricia about, I mean, I'm sorry that I wasn't passionate enough about the European project. But let me sort of clarify how I view Europe now. I mean, I'm a pro-European. I mean, this is actually a very sort of British pro-European position. I'm a pro-European, but I worry a lot about the European single currency and, since the refugee crisis, about Schengen. In other words, these two projects within the European project, which I think have the potential to destroy the EU. And it's partly because I'm a pro-European and I believe in the European project that I worry about that. And this comes back to the point that you were just making about love. I mean, one of the tragedies of the last 6 years, it seems to me, is this project which was meant to bring Europeans closer together and overcome these historic feuds between European peoples, is actually now causing animosity. And I can't quite see how you get past that. At what point do Europeans start to actually like each other more again? That, I think, is, in the end, one of the big questions here. And I can't quite see how you do that in the context of the euro and in the context of Schengen. So, in a sense, my position is precisely a pro-European position that makes me sceptical about these two projects within the European project. And that brings me to this question about is there a general anti-elite kind of moment, and where does Euroscepticism fit into that? I think there is a broader anti-establishment or anti-elite mood throughout the West, but I don't think it's a sort of random. This isn't coming out of nowhere. I think this is a response to policies that Western elites have pursued for the last 30 years or so. And this is why I think we ought to be a little bit self-critical. And in particular, it seems to me what's driving this is, for various complicated reasons that I won't go into, I think what's happened is that decision-making has moved further and further away from the citizen, partly because of globalization, partly because of neoliberalism. People have this sense that we can change governments, but we can't change policy, because policy is determined at some higher level. Particularly in the context of globalization. And so really there is no alternative, as Merkel likes to say, to neoliberalism. And the reason that some of this is directed particularly against the EU, it seems to me, is there is a sense in which the EU is the ultimate example of this idea of technocratic governance, where, in a sense, what the EU, what European integration has always done since its beginnings with the coal and steel community, has been to take certain areas of policy, particularly economic policy, out of the realm of democratic politics and to create rules. And this is why I think there's this particular Eurosceptic surge. Because the European Union, I think rightly, is perceived as being the ultimate example of technocratic governance.
Which was supposed to be progress, by the way.
Exactly, it's the genius of the EU as well, because this is precisely what enabled us to overcome wars and so on.
Right, so we could make decisions without too much political interference, blah, blah, blah. Marek.
Well, short comment on Britain and Brexit.
Please.
Oh, how can I be unemotional about it? I'm emotional. I'm not hiding my emotions, my negative emotions about it. Don't expect Europeans to be cool on what the Brits did to us.
Yeah, that's
Number two, Britain is important, but the British political internal scene is irrelevant. What is important is Britain as an agent of international politics, defense politics. We can swallow the lack of Britain in the European economy. We will have problems in becoming or in staying on the surface as Europe without Britain. I agree. So it's not that I'm simply emotional. I hate this. Okay. I'm proud also. I'm proud also that my compatriot made these sobering remarks about us, about Europe. But still, this is the fact that when you go outside of Europe, the mood about European Union is much more positive than within Europe. Well, that's good to go out from Europe. But then the question remains, what's wrong with us? And I think that, well, we have complained in the last few years about deficit of democracy. The EU is a product of elites. Come on, it's obvious, and it couldn't have happened otherwise. But what about democracy? What about European demos? There was no European demos because the European Union and the European Commission was a standard scapegoat. All that was good was due to local, which is national politics or policymakers. All blame was put on, even if undeservingly, on those bloody Eurocrats. Well, what we did not do from the very beginning, at least from my perspective, it might be twisted, it might be unfair. We didn't discuss what is the common European interest of the Greeks, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Finns, the Swedes, the Poles. Is there something that binds us together? And we really didn't discuss, because we treated it for granted, European values. One thing that was not made obvious for countries like Poland 15, 20 years ago is to make it very clear. We are joining a community of values, not just interests. But even the interests were not spelled out clearly.
Thank you.
And now we are paying for this.
Oh, that's right. Listen, you've been great. I'd ask you to all sit there. And Nick Gowing is coming back for another of his sessions on thinking the unthinkable. So while Nick gets ready, please join me in thanking our excellent panel.
Thank you very much. Don't go, because Karim is going to speak as well in a moment. So if I may suggest that our host is going to say something just after Stacey and I have promised you that we would give a few more reflections on what today brings together, particularly the last 3 or 4 sessions, not just on the European Union, forgive me for having my back to you, but also on radicalization, on Atlantic security, and above all, Africa, just before lunch today. And one of the things that Stacey and I have been talking about is here we've been hearing about the Schengen Agreement and how that's in doubt at the moment, how democracy is under challenge, how the politicians and the governments are out of touch with the people. And then this morning, we were hearing about the need in Africa to bring countries together, to get over the visa problems, to get over the passport problems, and to talk about the eco as well. Stacey, what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time to also take lessons, let's say, from what's happening in the EU for Africa in terms of Pan-African integration and what that means. Do we have a shared vision? We have the Africa 2063 vision, obviously, and I think that really binds us together. I would say in respect to values and shared historical experiences, I would hope that Africa's position in the world is actually a uniting force. But at the same time, I think we really need to think very hard and very critically about what integration means, whether that's political integration, economic integration, social integration.
Because we've heard some very profound reflections here, just from a moment ago from Hubert Vedrine, talking about not factoring into policies the political risk and the risk of the way the people are going to see it in this newly connected world.
Yeah, and that relates then back to my point that I made this morning in terms of communication of, let's say, the political level and the constituent level. Emphasizing how important that communication is again, we can reflect on the European situation and the elites versus the people and the lack of communication that there seems to be. There seems to be a gap there.
You come from South Africa, although you're living in Utrecht at the moment. What about the disconnect in places like South Africa? Because what we've been seeing is public opinion around Europe in many ways is not reflected in opinion polls. What we've seen, and in America, is the fact that many people, when asked by opinion polls, have not actually given their view, but they've then expressed it in the ballot box or at the electoral machine.
Yeah, I think in the South African case, that is a huge issue that we face. I think we have a lot of contending views within the society that really need to be ironed out, let alone from government side to society. Bridging that is going to have to take a lot of communication within our society, within the various groups. I mean, South Africa is so diverse. You have so many groups. There is so much inequality. We have our history. We have our racial issues. It's a big project.
And more broadly around the 50-plus nations of Africa
Yes.
as well.
Yes, of course.
And let me just quote back to Steve, if he's still here, that very technical description you had there, Steve, of the crankiness of institutions. What have we learned, do you think, Stacey, in the last few hours about the crankiness of institutions compared to what the public seem to want?
I would say in terms of institutions, one of the things that I've picked up on is the inflexibility of institutions and the lack of institutions being able to adapt to change and rapid change. We seem to think in these box-like institution frameworks where, you know, it's very formulaic, 1 + 1 = 2 kind of a scenario. But I think we need to start thinking outside of the box and make sure that our institutions are able to adapt to the changes and that we are also flexible in our thinking about these institutions.
What here we're doing at Atlantic Dialogues is redefining that box, I suspect, even if it does have sides and a top. But thank you very much indeed. You all have your own views, but we thought we'd try and capture some kind of direction of travel, helicoptering above some of the more detailed analysis and also discussion here on the panel. Thank you all very much indeed. Karim, the floor is yours.
So thank you again for being here and see you soon.
Well.